Hi, welcome everyone to Everything You Need to Know About Microlearning webinar presented by Learning Seat. So good to have you all here. Today I'll be presenting along with Kate Boss. We're just going to give a couple of minutes now just to wait for some stragglers to join the conversation. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us on our webinar on microlearning presented by Learning Seat. For anyone who doesn't know, Learning Seat is a compliance and e-learning company based in Melbourne, and we've got several offices around the country as well. Okay, so today I'll be running the session. My name is Claire. I'm a product manager in Learning Seat's library. I'll also be co-presenting with Kate Boss. Kate, would you like to talk about yourself?
Thanks, Claire. Welcome everyone. So my background, for those who I haven't spoken to before, I come from a risk and compliance role. I've had 10 years experience in risk and compliance and over 15 years experience in financial services industry. So I'll be talking a little bit later today about the use of microlearning for compliance training.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. And I forgot to mention that I am from an instructional design background and also have a long background in communications and editorial. Moving right along. So in terms of the webinar today, we've allocated about 30 minutes. We'll take questions at the end. And at the end of the webinar, you'll also be able to find a recording of this webinar up on our website, www.learningseat.com. You'll also be able to find the slide deck, and we'll send you a link to a blog article related to this topic. So, microlearning, what is it? It's becoming more and more popular. I know I'm hearing the term used all the time, Kate. It's one of these buzzwords we're hearing in e-learning. It's a bit like m-learning, mobile learning, social learning. But what does it mean? At the moment, L&D and HR departments are being encouraged to deliver quality training in as little time as possible, and technology is quickly evolving to offer us more opportunities to do that. Uber is just a great example of a company that is employing microlearning, along with many others. So today we're going to talk about microlearning, how it can be defined, why it suits today's learners, and the learning benefits. We'll also take a look at workplace ethics, one of our microlearning products in Learning Seat's library. Let's talk about some definitions now. Because this is a webinar on microlearning and e-learning, I've got a multiple choice question for you. So which option defines microlearning? Is it A, a series of short lessons that supports long-term learning goals? Our recent product, Workplace Ethics, aims to do that. B, is it self-directed and informal learning, for example, YouTube videos? Or is it 3, performance support to aid reinforcement, otherwise known as incidental or supplementary training that you can access when you need it? And the answer is it's all 3, because the thing is it's a really broad category and it's essentially a new term that's being used to describe ways we've always learned. In the past we've had cheat sheets, job aids, tips sent by email, newsletter articles. It's the same stuff, it's just delivered differently now. And interestingly, the truth is that there's very little peer-reviewed research into microlearning itself. And however, we can see that there is research out there that backs some of the key characteristics of microlearning. And that's something I'm going to touch on later. So let's talk about when microlearning isn't appropriate, because I do think it's important to mention, Kate, that personally I think there will always be a place for your traditional e-learning module.
Definitely.
I think microlearning has some great benefits, but I think it's not always appropriate. 2 examples of this are when the subject matter requires complex skill building, for example, learning piano, and also when your subject matter is aimed at novice learners, because microlearning often provides a high level of learner control. It doesn't always work for novice learners who really need a bit more guidance in their learning. Let's move on to the characteristics now. Number 1, it's short. This is an easy one. As the name implies, microlearning is short. And you know, there's no agreed upon length either. So I've heard anything from 1 to 12 minutes. Having said that, I think we can all agree that the shorter the training, the better. Second, it's granular. This is a really important one. When I say granular, I mean that microlearning should really only cover 1 or 2 learning objectives at most. Let me give you an example now. If you think about a traditional bullying training, e-learning course of 30 to 45 minutes. Now, that topic can be mapped to maybe 4 overall learning objectives: impacts of bullying, legislation, bullying behaviours, and maybe something like seeking help. Now, if you were going to break that down into microlearning, you'd make sure that each bite of content or lesson that you develop would only cover 1 of those learning objectives. Third, it's relevant. Now, keeping content relevant is important for any e-learning, whether micro e-learning or a 20 to 45 minute linear course. But in microlearning, it's essential because you've got so much less to work with. You really want to pack a punch with microlearning. Just in time or point in time microlearning. So this means having learning available when a knowledge or skill gap is identified. And you can see how microlearning employed in this way would work really well when used as part of performance support or refresher training. It's mobile friendly. Now, microlearning doesn't have to be deployed on a mobile or a smartphone, but it does chiefly suit smartphones because it reflects the way learners access content. On our smartphones, we dip in and out of content just like we do in microlearning, so it's a really nice pairing. Let's talk delivery now. So look, microlearning can be delivered in so many ways, and I think this is one of the really exciting things about microlearning. Let's just look at one example. This is Learning Seat's new workplace ethics program, which is composed of 3 short bites of content. Again, this is just one way to do microlearning. There are so many ways that you can attack it. So with this product, we went mobile. Again, demonstrating that link between microlearning and mobile. We decided to use a tab structure that mimics mobile use. You can see that we've got this tab structure at the top. This reflects the way people use their phones currently. You look at Facebook, you look at Twitter, you look at websites on your smartphone browser, and more this kind of bar top navigation interface is becoming the norm. People want to dip in and out. Videos. Okay, so videos are just so suited to micro learning. Not only are people accessing content more and more on their smartphones, but they're increasingly using video as well. I mean, even my toddler enjoys watching videos on a smartphone, and she's 2. So that just goes to show you how popular it is. Okay, so we've also got tips and case studies in our product. Again, just another way that learners can dip in and out of content. Case studies are great because they help learners contextualise what they've learned so far. This is why scenarios can be employed really effectively in e-learning, any e-learning. Scenarios and quizzes. It's essential that these form a part of microlearning. As with all learning, it's important to give learners opportunities to apply what they've learned and reflect upon their progress. And look, this is all very well and good, but what does it mean for today's workers? Well, workers today are used to getting the information they need from the web straight away, whether it's TED Talks, YouTube videos, or social media updates in 25 characters or less. When we need information, we seek it from the internet, usually on our phones. It's instant gratification. And look, in my own life, I've seen this at dinner parties. It used to be that you could have a debate with someone over a fact and have no way to know the truth without going to the library and following it up in following days and contacting them to let them know that they were wrong. But nowadays, we resolve the debate immediately. We go to Google. That's it. And let's look at the facts here. Google's consumer barometer shows that in Australia last year, 90% of people accessed the internet for personal reasons and 83% used the internet daily. And that's just in the previous week. And it's not even limited to Gen Y. The barometer also shows that people over 45 are increasingly accessing the internet daily. The other thing with the World Wide Web is that we're just so used to being bombarded with information. Look at the 24-hour news cycle. As a result, time is at a premium. And you can see the way this is reflected in web content today. Easy example is listicles. And they're popular for a reason. They're digestible. And importantly, they allow us, they give us the ability to estimate just how much time we're going to have to devote to a task. I mean, we're all guilty of reading them. Just recently I read, and this is embarrassing, Kate, 10 Hollywood actors you didn't know were redheads. That is time I'll never get back again. But I was attracted to it because it was an easy read. And on the plus side, I now know Ewan McGregor is a redhead. So I've got that in my kit bag. An early adopter of listicles is BuzzFeed. And even reputable news websites are doing it. Even The Age does it, for example. Another tactic used on websites to help people work out how much time they'll need to devote to a task is the inclusion of read time estimates. And Medium, that social microblogging platform, is a great example of this. This is just another example of a technique that can actually be used successfully in e-learning, in microlearning, my apologies. And video. We've covered the way people today access textual content online, but that's only part of the story. With bandwidths increasing and the proliferation of filming capabilities on smartphone, video is becoming a key way for people to access information. Again, if we reference Google's consumer barometer, you can see that people are watching short videos online more and more, and they prefer to do so on their smartphone. Here's another interesting example of short videos used effectively. This is Taste Made. So this is a website that features short 1-minute cooking videos. And I don't know about you, but whatever is in that Nutella dish, I want to eat now. But let's get into the nitty-gritty, the research, the learning benefits behind microlearning. Of course, there are organisational benefits as well, including reduced seat time and responsiveness to training gaps. But I think, Kate, you're going to cover off some of that later in your portion. Okay, so in terms of learning benefits, number 1, reduces cognitive load. Cognitive load is the idea that learning requires you to process information in a specific order, from sensory memory to working memory and finally to long-term memory. It's about retention. And we can break that down into intrinsic and extrinsic load. It sounds complex, but it's not really. Basically, intrinsic load is about the intrinsic nature of the information being absorbed, and extraneous load is about how the content is presented. So microlearning minimises extraneous cognitive load because, well, it's shorter, and 2, because it is shorter, it only includes the most pertinent information, so you can cut the fluff, so to speak. Also, microlearning encourages autonomous learning, or at least grants learners more control. So giving learners control over their learning, whether through pacing or allowing them to navigate content in a non-linear way, offers better learning outcomes. Also, microlearning offers point-in-time or just-in-time training. So because microlearning is shorter, it's highly relevant and it's accessed when it's truly needed. And contextualisation and relevancy is really important for learning. But the other part of this, the other benefit of point-in-time training or just-in-time training is motivation. And when I say motivation, I'm talking about intrinsic motivation. What motivates you personally to learn? Because when a person is intrinsically motivated, they're motivated by their own internal rewards. And research shows that when you're driven to complete something for your own sake, you're much more likely to retain the information. Finally, and this is a big one, I think this is a really great thing about microlearning, especially when you roll it out in conjunction with traditional courses. This is about spaced learning. So microlearning really comes into its own when you consider how it can be used as part of learning campaigns, which offer spaced learning opportunities. Spaced learning basically means spacing opportunities for learning over time, so training with intervals. So, as an example, you could send out a course at the start of the year, a 30-minute course, and you could follow it up with quarterly bites of learning. It could be anything from, I don't know, case studies to interviews or case law updates. Because it's really beneficial if long-term retention is the goal, as is often the case. So Kate, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks, Claire. So, as I mentioned at the start, I've spent the last 10 years in risk and compliance as a risk and compliance manager in the financial services industry. And my role as a risk and compliance manager was also to develop the enterprise-wide e-learning. So I think I speak from experience when I talk about the challenges associated with compliance training in general. So one of the biggest challenges of compliance training is really its own public relations campaign that we have, the marketing of compliance training to the business. So why should I, as a learner, want to do that particular compliance training module? So this is a real summary, and I'm sure there's more challenges than these 4, but really the 4 key that I'll look at today is making it engaging. So making sure your audience wants to do that training in amongst other types of training they might be doing, product-related training, skill-based training, learning about, the latest modules, the latest release perhaps of Microsoft Office Suite, other types of training that they might be required to do. So how do you make your training as engaging, if not more? Making sure you're not lecturing to your audience. And this is a typical thing with your more traditional e-learning modules, is really preaching to your audience. So we'll look at that as a challenge as well. Then there's also the modern working environment, and Claire's touched on a lot in her section of this webinar as well. So looking at the fact that no longer is our working environment purely just at your desk. And the fourth and final challenge we'll look at is just the content overload. So with, as we've said, the more traditional e-learning style, you've got a 45-minute, even up to an hour-long module, which is just heavy content overload. So we'll look at the benefit of that when it comes to compliance training. Okay, so if we first look at making it engaging, when it comes to compliance training and making it engaging for all audience types, we've got to look at those who would prefer to read or view a short video, or perhaps look at diagrams and imagery. So whilst traditionally we may have looked at newspaper articles that just have pure text, with obviously modern newspaper articles, and obviously now we view most of our newspapers via things like our Herald Sun app or Age app, etc., as well as just getting news feeds into our email. There's a lot more imagery, which invites you more to have a look at that content if you compare it to newspaper clippings of old. Turning what is considered fairly dull content, which I think most people could agree compliance content can be, into something with real practical application they can walk away and implement in their day-to-day activities. But putting too much into one long course can still be overwhelming. So even if we've implemented a few videos and possibly 2 or 3 images per slide in a traditional e-learning module, we still are going to bombard them with too much information. To have the most impact, you still need to look at focusing on 1 or 2 key learning objectives and do that one topic very well, as Claire's already touched on. We need to shift away from preaching to or lecturing your audience. Allowing for the audience to decide in which order they want to watch the content is a big factor. As we're seeing with the younger generation learners, they generally like to be in control of what they spend their time on and don't really appreciate being dictated or lectured to, especially when we're talking about behavioural change. When we roll out a 45-minute module on the 13 Australian privacy principles and give them no choice but to click through every screen and answer a 10-question quiz at the end, we're just lecturing to our learners, and more often than not, crossing our fingers, they're absorbing some of that content. When we chunk it down into short and sharp messages, it makes it far easier for learners to walk away with 1 or 2 key lessons and make those immediate changes to how they work and how they behave. I've also seen it really work well when the learner has to choose the course of action. So when making an ethical decision, for example, when the learner gets to decide how they might personally handle a situation, they get to apply that learning immediately. They're in control and faced with a relevant situation that they might actually face in their day-to-day activities. Regardless of whether they choose the right path or not, they're at least learning from that mistake, perhaps. 6 years on from my own experience with a series of these style of modules where they were very video-based, I still remember them. So it clearly was effective when you put the learner in the driver's seat. Anywhere, anytime, and this touches a lot on what Claire's also covered in terms of the way in which we access information these days. So accessibility is also a big trend in learning, and if we want to prevent the inevitable massive eye roll when we release another compliance module, we need to take the content to the learner rather than dictating again the location they'll consume it in. What most people have is a daily commute. I know myself, I spend an hour on the train each day to work. So whether it be 15 minutes or an hour on a train, tram or bus, the time is generally spent checking the newspaper apps, as we've touched on, might be watching reruns of Game of Thrones or catching up on a friend's posts on social media platforms. These are all things that I shouldn't be surprised anymore, but when I look around the train of a morning, everyone's face is buried in their smartphone or tablet. But this is also the perfect chance for learners to access 5-minute microlearning. We have their undivided attention at that particular point. With microlearning that's designed for a tablet or smartphone, a learner may have started their microlearning module in the office in between client meetings or project deadlines, but they can and want to finish that particular module on the train on their way home from work. Giving them flexibility again means that they're driving their learning and will feel more compelled to do it. And let's look at being content heavy. As a compliance manager, the amount of regulations, policies and procedures I needed to be aware of at times was overwhelming. So putting them into a long and dry text-based training module is never going to reach your audience in the most effective way. As someone who herself developed some long and dry text-based training modules, I can say that it is far easier focusing on short and sharp messages than where to start on making a big chunk of the work health and safety guidelines into a 1-hour course. You are far more likely to retain a funny 3-minute YouTube video or recall a social media meme than a 45-minute privacy training module. If we're specific on the learning outcome we want to achieve, set about it in an engaging manner and expect our learners to walk away and apply only one behavioural change from a micro-learning course, then this will be an easier course for us to develop and for the learner to consume and, importantly, apply in their everyday activities. Add to this the fact that legislation or regulation changes, you have one short module, not a whole long course to update. So if you need to retrain your learners due to legislative change, for example, then you can also just push out that 5-minute micro-learning course rather than requiring them to sit through a full traditional e-learning course. So how do we go about using it? So you may still use your traditional style course or a program of several micro-learning modules for your workers' initial induction training when they commence with your organisation. You may also still use this in a blended learning fashion with face-to-face training, which has its place in compliance training, especially when running a discussion or a debate regarding a course of action when it comes to compliance training. The subsequent years, you can choose to roll out maybe a staggered micro-learning module or series of staggered micro-learning modules over a number of months or quarters, or just choose 1 or 2 key modules which still cover your key legislative concepts. And I guess with all compliance training, we have to make sure that we're still making our learners aware of the key legislation that sits behind it. How we share that information is the important part when it comes to microlearning. So using case studies, using videos, showing them real life examples of that behaviour that we're asking them to understand and be aware of and obviously apply to their everyday life is the important part too. So you may do the first year that a employee or worker starts with the organisation, they do a full traditional style. The next year they do a series of micro-learning bites. The following year they may return to doing the more traditional style. So being able to break that up also allows the learner to know that they're not necessarily going to do the same course year in and year out in the same style. You might also rotate these micro-learning modules each year or even only choose micro-learning modules for certain teams or roles within your organisation. So with example of, say, an anti-money laundering module, you might choose to make specific bites available to only certain roles within the organisation that might be more likely to come across transactions with clients and customers that might have more access to being utilised for money laundering purposes. So whilst there might be a series of, say, 4 micro-learning modules that are targeted at general awareness, the 5th and 6th module might be more targeted at people in those transactional roles. Targeted in training and remediation is also good with the use of when you have a systemic issue within the organisation. A whole team failing to follow a procedure or skipping that necessary process it complies with, you've got at least the ability to actually push that 5-minute microbite out to that particular team or those individuals to remediate an issue or a breach within the organisation. So that's how it's important as well. In short, you can't expect to deliver your compliance training and key messages in one way anymore. You need to think about different methods to reach your audience in a way that has the most impact on their behaviour, and certainly short and memorable micro-learning goes a long way in achieving this. Who would have thought we could bring engaging, short and sharp compliance messages in exciting ways to workers? Turning our audience's expectations of dull training on its head is an exciting new chapter for training in general, but even more exciting for compliance.
Thanks so much, Kate. That was great. We're just going to have a bit of a Q&A session now, so feel free just to send your questions through. I will say that we will also provide an email address on the next screen where you can send any questions after the presentation.
Okay, so we've got a question from Rob. I think you can take this one, Claire. So Rob says, I'm an LMS administrator, Learning Management Systems Administrator. Microlearning sounds great, but does deploying it take longer than a standard e-learning SCORM course?
Look, it can seem, I mean, that's a really good question from Rob. It can seem daunting, but actually there are strategies you can put in place to make it as easy as possible. What I would say is that it's important to take some time to really plan out your training program over the year if you can, which can help you with organising that. The other thing you can do is in your LMS there are so many automated systems that you can use to help you make that deployment easier. Also, you can bundle content together. It's much easier to bundle some content together and deploy it than deploy separate bytes if it doesn't work for you.
Definitely.
Okay, we've got another one from Alicia. So Kate, she says, I'm interested in microlearning, but how can I get buy-in from the decision makers in my organisation to go with that?
Okay. Now that's a really good question. So I mean, we've given a lot of information here today about the different benefits of microlearning. And I think some of the key ones are obviously thinking about speaking to the duration, and as Claire touched on, having less seat time is obviously a key consideration if you're thinking about an organisation of potentially 1,000 plus employees and spending 45 minutes a piece on a traditional e-learning style, as opposed to having 1 or 2 or 3 even short micro-learning modules. I think the key thing when you're speaking to getting buy-in from decision makers in an organisation, it's obviously presenting the facts. And we've just made a start here today with the types of information we've provided to you. But certainly you can always contact us for further information. We're also looking at releasing a white paper on the e-learning for your business, and it covers off on how to write an effective business case for e-learning. So we'll look at providing that in the next week or so.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much for that, Kate. I'm just wary that we're running out of time here. We do have some more questions there. I think what we'll do is get back to them after the webinar.
Yeah, certainly. We're happy to answer those questions following this particular webinar.
So just to give you a little bit more information, if you do have any further questions, please feel free to contact us at inquiries@learningseat.com, or you can just give us a call on the number there. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a good day. Okay, bye.